Hello from Stuart Lee. Today in Famous Faces Presents, we catch up with Peter Hain, better known or officially known as the Right Honourable Lord Hain of Neath in the House of Lords. He grew up as a kid in South Africa. He then moved to England and he now sits in the House of Lords. He is determined to fight the state capture that has overwhelmed South Africa, and he talks all about that today. And I asked him, first of all, how things have changed in the South Africa that he knew as a kid.
Dramatically different. This was at the heart of apartheid in the early 1960s, when my parents were at the height of their anti-apartheid activism in Pretoria. And we were under constant surveillance. Our phone was tapped. There were special branch officers at the bottom of our garden gate or parked outside at the drive, followed us around wherever we went, including me going to school, which was a total waste of their time, followed my bicycle all the way. And my mom and dad were arrested and jailed for 2 weeks. I was 11 years old at the time and woken up in the middle of the night. A year before that, my brother and I had been woken up in the early hours with special branch officers searching through our sports files for incriminating evidence against my mom and dad, which they didn't have. Our files were sports clippings because we're sports mad young South African boys. So it was a very different South Africa. Nelson Mandela was in jail by 1962 after a trial, having been captured, a trial in Pretoria that my mom was the only white person normally in the gallery reserved for whites. The black gallery was packed, but she was usually the only one in the white gallery. And he would turn to her as he came into the dock and salute her with a clenched Amandla salute, and she would return that. So we were living a rather a life quite unusual for many of my relatives or my school friends' parents. They were an extraordinary couple, my mum and dad, Adeline and Walter Hain. My mum born in Port Alfred and my dad born in Durban.
How were you first aware that your parents were doing stuff which might be not the norm?
Well, my mum and dad joined the Liberal Party of South Africa, which after the ANC and the PAC and the Congress of Democrats had been banned in 1960, was the only non-racial universal franchise political party that was then legal until it too was forced to disband in 1968. So when I was 8 years old, my mum and dad started to get really active in Pretoria in the Liberal Party there. And we were used to having meetings in our house with black activists coming to the house. That was unique amongst, again, any of my cousins or school friends of my age. There was a particular black activist, Elliot Mgadi, who said that this is the first time he'd ever come through the front door of a white man's house because, of course, under apartheid, blacks were servants if they were anywhere near or in white houses, and they came through the back door. So quickly, from about aged 8, I would say, in 1958, I started to be aware my mom's and dad's political activity, helped them distribute leaflets in a by-election in Pretoria, and was aware that there was an old Gestetner duplicator in our house that was always having those old inky stencils, wax stencils that my mom used to type news bulletins on in the corner of our living room. So things like that. Gradually, amidst a normal South African boyhood, white South African boyhood, absolutely fanatical about sport, playing soccer with my brother well into the dark hours until we couldn't see the ball anymore, making a cricket field in our front lawn, cricket pitch, learning how to play cricket, playing cricket later when I left Hatfield Primary School in Pretoria, where I was head prefect, and then went to Pretoria Boys High. I played cricket, initially rugby and then soccer, because that was my real passion for Berea Park first, but then mainly Arcadia Shepherds at
So
the Caledonian Stadium.
you have a dream of what did you see down your career path? Did you see yourself as a professional footballer? What did you have in mind?
I would have loved to have been a motor racing driver. That was pretty well all I thought about being a Formula One driver, because my dad had taken me to the old Grand Central circuit outside Pretoria in the late 1950s. And then when the Kyalami circuit was built in, I think, round about 1960, we used to go there quite regularly, particularly for the 9-hour race, which was an overnighter. We used to pull up our old Volkswagen Combi van and sit on top at Clubhouse Corner. So, yeah, I only thought about that sort of boyhood romanticism. I never thought I'd be politically active, although increasingly politics was part of our daily life at home. A mixture of normal, in the sense normal for white South African boys, of sport and outside activity, and devoted parents. My parents, besides being incredibly active politically, and my dad, a well-respected architect who designed hospital laboratories, were also fantastic parents in terms of normal parenthood of children, and there were 4 of us. So my dad would play cricket with us. He'd come and watch us play cricket or rugby when I played rugby at Pretoria Boys High, which was only for a year, and I gave it up. I didn't really like it. I saw it as the symbol of apartheid on the rugby field, as most black South Africans did, and I was kind of alienated from it. And I was really passionate about soccer, so I played that. And my mum and dad used to come and watch us until, of course, they were issued with banning orders, and that was another abnormality. My mum was banned first as the chief activist of the two. My dad had worked during the day, she scurrying about Pretoria, bailing out detainees, searching for young defendants in court, and making sure their parents, who were around the court trying to find out what had happened to their teenage sons in their early teenage years, and things like that. My mum was banned in 1963, and that, of course, made her overt, open political activity impossible, because it was designed to silence you. And I remember that very clearly, age 13, the special branch coming and presenting her with her banning order. And there were many clauses in a banning order, pages and pages of them. You were restricted to meeting more than one other person at a time.
Goodness.
So after...
In outside the house?
In or outside the house. I mean, this is excluding her family. Okay. But when you speak of our house, we used to hold diplomatic parties in our living room. It was a modest home. We were not in any way well off. We were on a modest income. But we used to hold diplomatic parties for the foreign ambassadors, so that the American ambassador and the rest could meet black activists in the main that they didn't have an opportunity to meet. And my mum and dad used to entertain them and do the introductions and be at the heart of the party. But when my mum was banned, she couldn't be in the living room with everybody else, including my dad, who was left to do the hosting on his own. She sat in the kitchen, and I used to take the ambassadors through one by one to meet her sitting at the kitchen table. If she met them one by one in the kitchen on her own, she was not breaking the terms of her banning order. Oh, if she stepped next door into the living room, she could have been arrested, because there was special branch around the house for contravening her order. So it was that kind of Orwellian experience that we had all the time. And of course, another clause in a banning order, amongst the many, was that you could not communicate with another banned person. So when they banned my dad a year after my mum, this presented the government, and John Foster, later, of course, Prime Minister, who was Minister of So-Called Justice, with a dilemma they hadn't faced, which is a married couple being banned. And so they gave them special permission, a new clause retrospectively inserted as an addendum to my mum's banning order, and a clause for the first time in my dad's banning order that gave them exceptional permission to talk to one other banned person in the universe, namely each other.
Right.
So when I say Orwellian, there was that kind of side to it all. When we left the house, say my mom was driving us around on normal social or shopping activities, us four kids in the back of a little VW Beetle or the combi van, the police would be following us the whole time. And once she had to alert a fellow activist that she'd heard through the grapevine he was due to be arrested. And she left our home to go to his house to alert him. And she pulled up at a set of robots indicating to go right in the right-hand lane, and then jumped the lights and screamed off to the left. And lost the special branch who were in the right-hand lane and got to the house just in time to alert him. He left and caught a plane out of Johannesburg Airport, and the special branch arrived later that night. So there was all of that going on in our house at the same time as a normal boyhood. So we had a juxtaposition of the abnormal with very loving, supportive parents, and the normal, as they looked after us, and we played with our school friends and our cousins as well in Pretoria until my mom's older brother stopped that happening. There was a side with our relatives which was very difficult and was very hurtful for both my parents, particularly my mom, who worshipped her elder brothers, in that they were in business, in construction, and they felt that her activities, because she was notorious by this time in the early 60s in Pretoria, always in the Pretoria news, always taking food to Sharpeville in 1960 after the massacre, then visiting townships like Attridgeville and Mamelodi and Lady Selborne before it was razed to the ground to make way for a white suburb. All those townships around Pretoria, she was a regular visitor to them. And so she was increasingly notorious. And so her relatives, with the exception of her younger sister, my Aunt Jo, who's still alive, she was active in the Liberal Party in Grahamstown, working with Rhodes University students. But the rest were not politically active at all and distanced themselves from my mum and dad, to the extent that, as I say, my younger sisters were no longer allowed to play with their similar age cousins because they felt that their business and lives might be contaminated by mum and dad's activity. Understandably, from their point of view, you could argue, sure, because anti-apartheid activists were very unpopular with most of the white community, well, virtually all the white community, and certainly with the authorities.
Now, there must have been a moment when it all changed, because your parents had to make the call to leave the country. That was something to do with, I think, it became impossible for your dad to make a living?
Yes. As a result of this increasing repression, both of them banned, and of course a banning order also meant you couldn't leave, in their case, the Pretoria Municipal District. It confined you to whatever municipal district you were living in, amongst many of the other restrictions. And increasingly, the authorities, the government made it clear to architectural firms in Pretoria that they could not employ him. So the firm and of course the Pretoria municipality would never have employed him, nor would the health department or any kind of public agency. So he then went to work on his own, and because he was highly regarded, he got a lot of work, set up a little office literally on his own in Pretoria. And when the special branch found out that he was still getting work, they identified who he was getting it from and stopped them doing that as well. Right. So there was no way we could continue to survive in South Africa. The family didn't have an income. My dad couldn't, get paid or do paid work, and very much against their will and very much against us four kids' desires, we had to uproot ourselves and go into exile in March 1966. We took a train from Pretoria, watched by the special branch onto the train, given one-way exit permits, not allowed to come back to the country, and we're on the train all the way down to the dockside in Cape Town. We were again watched off the train onto the ocean liner, which was the cheapest way to travel to Britain, where my dad had got a job in London.
Yeah.
And we set sail on a Union Castle ocean liner for London. And I remember one of the most distinctive memories about that exit from South Africa, a country, beloved country we never wanted to leave. And my mum and dad felt they were betraying their comrades and the struggle, but they didn't have any option, like a lot of other people who went into exile. And we steamed out of Cape Town. It's now the waterfront area where those docks were, of course. And we passed Robben Island. And I remember looking out as the Cape rollers were starting to really heave the boat, looking out at Robben Island as we went past and thinking about Nelson Mandela there in his cold prison cell and wondering, how he was doing, because at this stage he was nearly 4 years, 3.5 years into his long prison sentence.
So now you arrive in England at what age?
16. We steamed into Southampton on a grey, rainy morning, having left sunny South Africa, and we thought it didn't improve our sense of optimism or grief about leaving our own country, I can tell you.
And then you presumably finished school, studied?
Yeah, I went to school in London, didn't enjoy it because I loved Pretoria Boys High School and didn't really enjoy it, but I did well at exams and then went to university, beginning as an engineering student, because that was the way my kind of strongest subjects had gone at school. Mechanical engineering student at Imperial College, which was one of the top universities for engineering in the UK, and did a student engineering apprenticeship with a company for the year before in 1968-69. But then by then I was getting more and more involved in politics through the British Young Liberals, who were very radical socialists and very into direct action. And it was a pretty exciting time to start getting politically conscious in my own right, as opposed to, supporting my mum and dad, which I'd, of course, been proud to do. They joined the anti-apartheid movement. I did too. And one thing led to another, and I got more involved in the sports struggle, the anti-apartheid sports struggle, particularly working with Dennis Brutus, who, of course, the coloured South African poet and former Robben Island prisoner, who became chair of SANROC, the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, again forced into exile, as was Chris de Brolio, SANROC's secretary. Those two were similarly aged to my mum and dad, but they took me under their wing, must have spotted a sort of hyper young activist with some potential. I don't know. I was just an ordinary activist growing up in the political world. And one of the things I remember about that time in 68 particularly was, of course, the Basil de Vera. One of the things I remember about that time in the late 1960s was, of course, the Basil d'Oliveira affair. As you'll know, Basil d'Oliveira was a top-class cricketer, coloured Cape Townian, who could not play. He was brilliant, but he couldn't play for his country in South Africa because he was the wrong colour. He couldn't play for Western Province, then the name of the provincial side, I think it's maybe Cape Cobras now. He couldn't play for Western Province. He couldn't play for the top clubs, cricket clubs in Cape Town. So he had to go to England in kind of cricket exile, if you like, to play initially in the Lancashire League and then for Worcestershire County Cricket. And he became so well respected as a top-class cricketer that he became a regular in the England cricket side. Now, this is relevant to what then happened to me and what happened in the sports struggle, because he was a regular from around 1966, when my brother and my mom and I used to go and watch England play the West Indies, which was an amazing series, cricket series in 1966, the summer. We'd hardly arrived when it had started, and we were very excited to go and do that. And Basil D'Oliveira was in the side, so we saw him at Lord's and Trent Bridge in Nottingham and the Oval, all those, legendary cricket grounds in England. And then came the projected tour by England to South Africa, starting in late 1968. And the team was selected round about July, I think, 1968, July, August. And unaccountably, because he was one of the most one of the most successful members of the England cricket team in terms of his batting average, in terms of he was a kind of change bowler, medium pace swing bowler, and he was unaccountably left out of the England side for South Africa. Well, that caused an uproar. Having been a regular for a couple of years, everybody expected him to be in the side. He was left out. It emerged later because of a deal done by the English selectors led by Doug Insall for England and the South African cricket authorities, who basically said, we can't have him in the side. So they left him out. But there was such a media and public uproar, and it was quite crucial for the middle ground of opinion, who were cricket supporters or just middle England in political terms, who didn't really understand the apartheid sports struggle. It was an important change maker in people beginning to understand the reality of the unique intrusion of politics, in this case, vicious racial politics, into the heart of South African sport, the Basil D'Oliveira affair. After this fuss had raged for a few months, Tom Cartwright, the England medium-fast bowler, withdrew from the side, having been selected, said he had an injury, though there's another story to that, as I later found out. And D'Oliveira was selected. And within days, Prime Minister by then, John Foster, had fulminated at a speech, I think, at a National Party rally, that this was the team of the anti-apartheid movement, which was clearly absurd and a complete fabrication, and cancelled the tour.
Because of the
you have that background,
non-white cricketer.
Because of one non-white South African cricketer. Because, of course, Basil D'Oliveira coming back to his own country, playing at Newlands in Cape Town, which he could only ever visit as a spectator, never play at, and playing for England in his own country, would have just showcased the absurdity of apartheid and also the repressive nature of apartheid in sport. So that's why the nationalist government under Foster banned it. But of course, that created absolute uproar. If the outcry over D'Oliveira's exclusion a few months before, initially from the team selection, had created, and if that had been kind of quite public and serious, it was as nothing compared with what followed. I mean, the opinion in Britain was incredulous. It didn't surprise me. It didn't surprise Dennis Brutus or my mum and dad or Christa Brolier or any of the leaders of the British anti-apartheid movement like Abdul Minty. We thought that this would probably happen. And then, to cap all of that, so we're talking about September 1968 when Foster stopped the tour, due to start a few months later. Then a few months after that, in January 1969, as if nothing had happened, as if absolutely nothing had occurred at all around Basil D'Oliveira, the English cricket authorities invited South Africa to tour England in 1970.
They thought that was a way out.
And I was absolutely outraged, as was the whole of the British anti-apartheid movement, but particularly I was. I mean, I was quite unusual for an anti-apartheid activist in being sports mad. most people involved in radical youth politics at that time, or in the senior reaches of the anti-apartheid movement, were political activists. They were not so much sports fanatics like me. And so I issued a public statement. I was then a press officer for the southeast region of the of the Young Liberals. And I issued a press release off my own bat saying that we'd disrupt the tour if it came. And that was a threat of direct action, of non-violent direct action, that initially came from me, and which led later on, the following year in the same year, in September 1969, to the launching of the Stop the 70 Tour campaign, focused on the stopping of the 1970 all-white South African cricket tour. And it was my brainchild, and I didn't expect to be the leader of it. I thought I'd be one of the kind of rank and file activists. But Chris de Broglie and Dennis Brutus particularly encouraged me to be the chair of it. And we formed this committee and launched it at a press conference and threatened to disrupt the tour with direct action. And we had realized a bit late in the day that the Springbok rugby team was due to tour the following month, beginning at the end of October, with a match against Oxford University. So I announced that we would disrupt the Springbok rugby tour in order to pave the way for building a mass campaign to the cricket tour. And when I pledged this, I was pretty confident we could do it. I kind of felt it instinctively, but we didn't have a proper organization. The British anti-apartheid movement, though it was affiliated to the Stop the 70 Tour campaign, was a conventional pressure group, writing letters, delegations, organizing pickets, rallies in Trafalgar Square, demonstrations outside sports grounds, and so forth. It had never supported or engaged in direct action, militant action, and was very nervous about it, and in fact tried to persuade me, its leadership did, to not to kind of set up the Stop the 70 Tour campaign, but I went anyway. And very quickly it all snowballed, as I'd hoped it might, and I found myself a notorious national political leader in Britain, as rugby matches were assailed by thousands of demonstrators invading the pitches, placing siege to the ground outside or the Springboks hotels and things like that. Each one of the 25 match tours had demonstrations against it. Many were disrupted. And if you talk to, for example, Tommy Bedford, the vice captain of that side, that 1969-70 Springbok side, the all-white Springbok side, he will tell you that it was horrible being on the inside of that, and quite unlike any other experience of a Springbok tour, any of the players led by Dawie de Villiers, of course, subsequently a member of the apartheid government, and a member of the Broederbond, that any of them had ever experienced. And that set the tone for the build-up to the cricket tour, which, to cut a long story short, though I could go into the detail, resulted in that cricket tour being stopped because it would have been wrecked, and there would have been public disorder on a massive scale, damage to race relations, and a whole lot of other factors, which caused the Labour government at the time to request the England cricket authorities to cancel the tour, which they reluctantly, very reluctantly, eventually did. And we got 100% victory out of that. And I was by then public enemy number one in
I was going to say,
in the South African media.
You were a hero amongst the anti-apartheid movement, which I don't know how big it would have been in England. I mean, how politically aware were people without the benefit of modern day communications?
Oh, by the time we were ready to physically stop the cricket tour, the movement had grown to about 100,000 people. It was huge, because unlike a lot of other protests, for example, that I joined against the Vietnam War or against apartheid or against Ian Smith's illegal independence declaration and rebellion in the old Rhodesia, because this was all happening in the late 1960s, they all focused on London. These matches, the Springboks initially, and so it was intended the cricket team, were all over the country. They were going to Manchester and Scotland and Wales and different provincial towns and cities in England. So you could mobilize local people. They didn't have to get on a train or a bus or a coach to get to London.
Right.
And that increased the size and the energy of the campaign exponentially compared with a normal national campaign, because you could do it on your own doorstep. And that's what we did. And I'm actually, funnily enough, writing about this at the moment, because next May, is the 50th anniversary of the stopping of the 90 all-white South African cricket tour. And I'm co-authoring a book called Pitch Battles, Protest, Play and Prejudice, with Andre Odendaal, the renowned sports historian in South Africa and former anti-apartheid resistance activist himself in the country. So we're well through writing that, and it'll be published in May next year, and will be a 50-year commemoration of that campaign.
Now take us on a whirlwind telescopic trip through your political career to where you ended up, where you are now in the House of Lords, or I'm not saying you've ended up, but where you are in the House of Lords. And then I want to talk to you about what you've been doing in South Africa's name from the House of Lords.
Well, when I became publicly notorious, especially amongst the white community in South Africa, but frankly also in Britain, where the right wing hated me, there was a lot of racism there at that time in Britain. Fascist groups and Nazi groups were very active, and I was a real hate figure and received a lot of threats. And rugby supporters and cricket supporters, particularly those of a small c conservative political bent, hated me as well. I mean, the level of notoriety and hate should not be underestimated. On the other hand, I had a lot of support from people of more liberal, radical, or left-wing persuasions. And in South Africa, a tremendous amount of support from Black South Africans who smuggled surreptitious messages out to send solidarity messages. And of course, the ANC was involved in the campaign in London. ANC members like Aziz and Esop Pahad, for example, subsequently ministers in the Mandela and Mbeki governments, and Ronnie Kasrils, of course, another subsequently minister and underground chief for the Umkhonto Isizwe MK. He was active in London as well. So there was that milieu going on. But I never thought I would ever end up as an MP. And when I did end up as an MP, elected in 1991, this is 21 years after the Stop the 70 tour campaign, I never expected to be a government minister. I was always a bit of a rebel and independently minded, who expressed my views, and party leaders didn't particularly enjoy those views sometimes. So I used to get raps over the knuckles, including even when I was in the cabinet. But I was appointed by Tony Blair right at the beginning of his government, Labour government, in 1997, and enjoyed 12 years of different jobs, from in Wales to the only to Britain's Africa minister, the only African-born British Africa minister that there's ever been, and maybe will ever be, who knows, and found that extremely interesting, also covering the Middle East, negotiating in the United Nations Security Council, chairing it on a number of occasions, and negotiating international treaties to ban landmines, for example, also to ban the trade in blood diamonds, which were used to fuel wars in Angola and Sierra Leone and in the DRC, paid with the arms paid for by blood diamonds. And when I was Europe minister, I negotiated an international treaty there as well. So I got a lot of experience, but the most fulfilling part of that immense privilege of being a government minister was to be Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, to be able to, under Tony Blair, negotiate the settlement that brought bitter old enemies who'd never even talked together, just hurled embittered insults at each other from both sides of the divide, either side of the divide between Catholic and Protestant, between nationalist and unionist populations, brought them together to share by Ian Paisley, the old fiery sectarian unionist leader, and Martin McGuinness, the IRA former commander and Sinn Féin leader. And that was extremely fulfilling, very hard work. So then when we lost power in 2010, I left office as a government minister, of course, and became a backbench Labour MP. And then out of the blue, my party leader, Ed Miliband, with whom I was very friendly, a close confidant in some ways, suddenly said in 2014, would you go to the House of Lords for me? I'd been already chosen and wanted to stand for another parliamentary term as an MP in what was expected to be the 2015 election, and was indeed held then. So this was a year before, and it was like a bolt from the blue, and I had to have a real, think about my future, sort of meaning of life kind of moment. And I'd never thought about going to the Lords. I always believe it should be elected, or at least 80% elected, as I still do now, because it's entirely appointed, apart from some hereditary peers, which is an historic anachronism, which is absurd. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I actually decided, well, I wasn't enjoying backbench life in Parliament as much as I had, or anything like as much as I had 12 years in government. Very few MPs get the opportunity and the privilege to be 12 years a government minister. I really enjoyed doing things and making a difference, which has always been my watchword. And so I decided to go to the House of Lords and was introduced there late in 2015, and the rest is history.
So I think you've come much more to prominence for a couple of reasons. One for maybe not so good a reason, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You have taken up, I think where so many South Africans who live here full time just have failed. You made it your task. You made it a challenge that you set about personally to bring to attention, and I'm talking in relatively recent times, the state capture issue, which has almost brought our country to its knees. In fact, I think we're on 1.5 knees at the moment, half a knee remaining. How did you decide to do it? And did you not realize the enormity of what you'd be taking on?
Well, this was more being in the right place at the right time than deciding this is what I intended to do. I was enjoying teaching at Wits Business School, where I taught about leadership and negotiating skills, dispute resolution, particularly drawing on my government experience, especially in Northern Ireland, but also internationally, and on communications and globalization and so on. And really enjoying that, trying to, impart some of the experiences and lessons that I'd learnt in my 50 years of political life. When I was introduced to senior ANC figures in July 2017, whilst I was in Johannesburg teaching, and talked to them about the gloomy state of South Africa under the Zuma presidency and the way it was just going down the pan, frankly, economically, governmentally, and in terms of an increasingly dysfunctional public administration. And I was being briefed by Pravin Gordhan and others. By the way, Pravin Gordhan, I think, is the hero of this part of South Africa's history. An incredible person and politician with such integrity and courage, who's withstood enormous threats, intimidation, and assaults on his family and himself. I mean, I just think he's a legend. And others, and we were kicking around.
I echo every single word you said, having been privileged to work with him for over a year very closely. I echo and ditto to that.
Well, I think every South African should. I mean, I know not everybody does because you read Twitter and so on, but I think the attacks on him are pathetic and despicable, and come from jaundiced sort of extremists for the most part, or Zuma apologists and so forth, from the corrupt stable of the ANC in South African politics, and the EFF and so forth as well. But there was a small group of people who suggested actually that there was something that I could do. I just said, is there anything I could do? Not expecting there to be, because this was a domestic problem. And they said, well, the international dimension to this has not really been exposed. And that led to me being introduced to some whistleblowers, both deep inside the South African state and in the commercial community, to provide me with the evidence, the ammunition, the bullets, and let me say this again, to provide me with the ammunition to enable me to fire the bullets in the House of Lords under parliamentary privilege, which is what I subsequently did on the state capture question, and involved and named all the international businesses that were complicit with the Zumas and the Guptas and the others engaged in that monumental looting and state capture. And so I hadn't expected suddenly to find myself an active figure on the South African political scene, as I had from in exile in Britain on the sports front in the late 60s and 1970s. But this just occurred and made a huge impact. I mean, I named Bell Pottinger in Parliament and asked for their license to operate as a public affairs agency to be withdrawn, and they went bankrupt the following week. Now, it wasn't only because of my intervention, but that was a material factor. I think there was a court action taken by the DA in London against them for their racist, vicious campaign of disinformation and fake news and lies, paid for by £100,000 by the Guptas, looted from South African taxpayers. And here was a global British public affairs company, which was engaging in that malicious and obscene, mainly social media campaign of disinformation. And what that illustrated is how a global firm like it, who, by the way, his mission was to manage the reputations of others, its clients, its business clients and politicians and so forth, forgetting about its own reputation, a deep irony there, and the damage to it by the sordid South African involvement. And it went bankrupt. And I think that shook up both the political class engaged in this corruption in the ANC in Britain, but also the international commercial and business community, because when it was a domestic South African issue, with the Daily Maverick and others exposing Amabungani and investigative journalists, brave, courageous investigative journalists who, by the way, have suffered similar intimidation, threats and harassment to what happened in the apartheid era, ironically, by the evil forces who are part of this corrupt elite. That was one thing. It might have been in the South African media, as you'll probably recall, every other day in the kind of 2016, 2017 period. But when it became, as a result of my interventions, on the front page of the Financial Times in London and globally, of the New York Times in New York and The Economist magazine, all of whom took an interest after I'd named HSBC and Standard Chartered and the Bank of Baroda and corporates like McKinsey and KPMG as all being complicit in this corruption and looting by basically facilitating money laundering in the case of the banks, and by working for the Guptas in their state capture operation, advising them and extracting fat fees in the process. When it reached the international political and media stage, that's when these global corporates started to hurt. And I suppose that's why, a number of people have been kind enough to say that intervention, those series of interventions that I made in the British Parliament had an impact. It's for others to judge, but I was pleased to be able to play a role again in the battle for the new South Africa. And in a way, I saw it as a bit of a continuum from the anti-apartheid struggle, because what was very painful for anti-apartheid activists like me and South African anti-apartheid activists, a lot of the ANC stalwarts, the Ahmed Kathradas, you remember how outspoken he was, and how outspoken the criticism was at his funeral of the Zuma corruption and the Guptas and so forth, and what was happening to South Africa, because what it was doing, all of this corruption, right at the top of the ANC, was betraying the very values of the freedom struggle so nobly led by Nelson Mandela and his comrades. And that struggle was about values of integrity and morality and justice and equality and human rights, every one of which values were completely being betrayed and prostituted by former President Zuma and his business cronies as the country was just systematically looted. And so I think, in kind of thinking of being proud of my parents' role and sacrifices, which were small compared with what many others did in the anti-apartheid resistance, I thought, they didn't do it. We didn't do it. I didn't stop Springbok tours and so forth, along with many other activists in Britain, in order to see this happen to South Africa. And so for me, it was a bit of a continuum. And it became a bit of a passion, and it still is, really, because the country needs rescuing from this near-death experience of corruption and state capture. And one of the worst things about it is not just the looting, which obviously is criminal and obscene, but also the cronyism, which has put people into key positions all the way down the ladder of public administration and services in South Africa, rendering a lot of them completely dysfunctional. That is another betrayal of the Mandela vision that inspired not just South Africans in the mid-1990s, but the entire world. So South Africa has gone from hero in that era to zero, frankly, and is just regarded with bewildered contempt by a lot of international opinion, which is tragic.
Now, I want to talk about the elephant in the room, which I alluded to earlier. I mean, there's no question that you've done remarkable stuff in England and for South Africa, and as a young activist, and then you carry that on into your political career. But there's this one speed bump, and I have to mention it, and I hope you'll take it from whence it comes, and that's your connection with the Motti Group. From the little that I know, and I'm just a guy sitting on the sidelines reading stuff that comes across my desk, it looked to me like he had a terrible reputation, the head of the Motti Group and his associates. And you got invited to become a consultant to help, from what I remember, grow South African businesses through Africa and African businesses into the world. Tell me about that and why you did, and was it a mistake?
Well, I was introduced to the Motti Group, I'd never actually even heard of it, by Paul O'Sullivan, the widely admired and respected anti-corruption campaigner who heads Forensics for Justice and has been a brave warrior in the battle against corruption. And I'd met him because of my anti-state capture work. And he introduced me to the Motti Group, and I thought I could help as an advisor, particularly in Zimbabwe after the change with Emerson Mnangagwa coming to office and Mugabe being deposed. And I had been a fierce critic of Mugabe, clashed with him the way he destroyed this once beautiful breadbasket of Southern Africa. And its economy and so on. And although Mnangagwa was his enforcer, and, people said to me, the leopard never changes its spots, many of us thought, well, this is an opportunity for a new beginning. Let's see if we can try and make it work. The Motti Group were the largest foreign investor in Zimbabwe with their interest in mining, particularly chrome mining in the main, and other business interests. And I thought, well, if I can help press the Zimbabwean government of that era through that influential business, then maybe I could do some good. But it very quickly became clear that Mnangagwa, having promised free and fair elections in July 2018, and having delivered them by and large for the first time in a very long time in Zimbabwe's troubled independence history, then immediately afterwards started reverting to exactly the Mugabe tactics, if not worse, gunning down peaceful protesters in Harare, which I publicly condemned. And it became obvious that, I couldn't play the role that I'd hoped to be able to play as an advisor to the group. And so I stopped doing so on an amicable basis, nearly a year ago in February of 2019. So that's it, really. That's the story. And there was some criticism for it. I understand that. And, sometimes you have to do difficult things in order to get an objective which you think is worthwhile. That's what I tried to do, but I decided I couldn't do that anymore, and so I ended it. Full stop.
Okay, thank you. Exclamation mark. Peter, tell me about the time you spent at the Zondo State Capture Commission, in the middle of November, third week of November. Tell me about the Zondo State Capture Commission and where you spent a day giving testimony. Is it a terrible thing to prepare for? Were you anxious? Were you concerned for your safety because you named big names, big corporate names, and individuals? Is it never a concern, a personal concern about your safety?
Well, personal concern about my safety is always with me, because anybody, who's as publicly known as I am, whether in Britain or as I found myself again, having been publicly had a very high profile in the late 60s, early 70s, now to find myself again in that position is, of course, vulnerable. And given that there are dark, sinister criminal forces, mafia forces, behind a lot of the state capture in South Africa, and they're still around, and they're trying to get back power again and trying to undermine President Ramaphosa, who's hugely respected around the world, and by me as well. I have been concerned about my security. My wife, Elizabeth, particularly concerned and anxious about it. And, in the old days of the anti-apartheid battle, I was sent a letter bomb in June 1972 at the family home where I was living with my parents still, by the South African security authorities, of the kind that assassinated Ruth First, the noted ANC activist in Maputo University, and killed many others around the world. Fortunately, mine had a fault in the timing mechanism, and Scotland Yard's anti-bomb squad, which was fighting IRA bombs at the time in London in 1972, came and dismantled it and took it away and made it safe and said it was powerful enough to blow up the whole house. And I've had various other threats and attacks on me over the years. But when I was approached in mid-2019 to give evidence to the Zondo Commission, it was on the basis, an exploratory basis, to see whether the international dimension, which hadn't so far really been covered in its deliberations and its important deliberations, which had focused mainly on evidence given on domestic state capture and corruption and looting. There was the international dimension to this, which of course I'd covered in Parliament in 2017, 2018, and exposed some of it in the British Parliament. So I didn't know whether I could help or not, but I was able to get the assistance of expert asset tracers, lawyers, and other forensic financial specialists who work and are very well informed and have considerable professional expertise in tracing looted money around the world. And they helped me draw up 10,000 words of written evidence. And because they know where all the weaknesses are in the international financial regulatory system, the way the banks move money around and become conduits, pipelines for trillions, I think it's 5 trillion American dollars looted and money laundered around the world each and every year, as I told the Zondo Commission. I mean, that is a prodigious amount of money. 5 trillion American dollars money laundered around the world. That's everybody doing it. The Guptas were only a tiny part of it. But I was able to get their expertise to put in quite a weighty document to the Zondo Commission, and when they received it, they said they'd like me to give evidence, which resulted in the appearance on Monday, the 18th of November, where I spent nearly 5 hours giving evidence. And I was pleased to do so because, I think that the focus has understandably and rightly been on the corrupt ministers, the corrupt politicians, the corrupt MPs, the corrupt councillors, and others in the political world who were part of this terrible episode in South Africa's history, along with the businesses, because it's always taken two to tango. You can't have political corruption just in its own world if actually the businesses are not offering any bribes and kickbacks in order to win contracts, as they all were, and for all I know still are in some parts of South Africa. I wouldn't be surprised, because this cancer of corruption is deep in the system. And so, I was particularly focused on the way that the international corporates had been up to their necks in this. The HSBCs, the Standard Charters, the Bank of Barodas, as I gave evidence to the Zondo Commission, they were the pipelines for the Guptas to money launder out of the country on an absolutely gargantuan scale, sometimes clean it, shift it around through Hong Kong and Dubai, tax havens in the Caribbean, and in some cases bring it back into the country, as happened with that public money for the Estina farm poverty-stricken workers in the Free State that was then came back in to pay for a lavish shindig in Sun City. So, I mean, I just found all this absolutely outrageous, and all of the corporates and the professional enablers, the KPMGs, the McKinseys, the SAPs, Bain & Co., Hogan Lovells, all these international respectable so-called global businesses and legal firms, they were the ones that made all this possible. They set up the shell companies. They advised on how to do all this money laundering, and they did the soft audits. And in the case of Hogan Lovells, whitewashed corruption in the South African Revenue Service. In the case of Bain & Co., actually coached Zuma's appointee, Tom Moyane, on how to basically dismember the South African Revenue Service and let the bad guys off scot-free and collapse its revenues. I mean, I just felt that needed to be focused on, which is what I did, but also with this forensic expertise that explained why it was so crucial to the whole domestic state capture, corruption, shameless looting that South Africa suffered from.
Strikes me there are two things that came out of your testimony, and two things that really we all need to focus on. One is trying to get as much of the money back, and they're obviously expert at hiding it. But in the same way, I think Praveen Gordon at a recent event said, you guys are expert in the financials and how these routes are set up. Give us your assistance to help us get it back. If you can set up the route, you know what to do, you know how it works, so maybe, do it in reverse. Do you think any of those named and shamed companies that you've mentioned are likely to offer their services? Because we don't have the money to pay for it because there's nothing left. Don't you think that's the least that they could do?
Yes, Praveen is right. He's absolutely right. That's what they should do. That's how they can repay their debt and some of the fat fees that they earned in this shameless looting. There is also the example that I mentioned to the Zondo Commission that might have been overlooked in the sort of volume of evidence, but I think it's really important. The Nigerian government has commissioned these lawyers and forensic experts. As it happens, these are London-based who are experts in this asset recovery, to recover $1.2 billion looted as part of an oil scam under the watch of Shell International, the Italian oil company ENI, and I think it's JP Morgan, the international bank. So they're in the frame for having assisted all of this. Now, as I understand it, the Nigerian government already got back 70 million of that, 1.2 billion. There's a long way to go. But the way these people work, and I found out about this earlier this year, the way these asset recovery agencies work is they work on a kind of no win, no fee basis. In other words, they only get paid if they recover the money and then a negotiated proportion of it. Now, I think that's worth looking at for South Africa, because if the Nigerian government kind of commissioned it successfully, why not the South African government? So that's one option, because, of course, one of the problems that the South African state now, at least largely under President Ramaphosa's values of integrity, and he's trying to clean it up, but they lack resources. The National Prosecuting Authority has been hollowed out. It's very short of resources. So the other agencies, the police, have been distorted, in the way they were under apartheid, ironically, to protect the bad guys rather than go after them and target some of the good guys. The public ombudsman, completely different to the public protector, completely different to Thuli Madonsela's renowned work as public protector, and the way she gained so much respect for her integrity and courage. I mean, to find the current public protector targeting the good guys like Pravin Gordhan and turning a blind eye seemingly to the bad guys, I just find astonishing. So, the point I'm making is that South Africa's institutions, admirable constitutionally and on paper, have been hollowed out and impoverished, and don't necessarily have the ability to get all this money back. So there to be more creative other ways of looking at it, including some of the corporates that assisted with this looting, including the banks. They should be part of assisting the government. But there are these other kind of innovative opportunities that I think are worth looking at.
And finally, because I know you've got to move on, in the last 5 minutes, summarize for me what you think needs to happen globally, locally and globally, to stop this kind of stuff happening. You talk about lifestyle audits which actually make a difference. If you bought a car, just show us how you paid for it. It's easy. If car dealers are not supposed to allow a suitcase of money to buy a car. It still happens. What do we need to do? Because if you've got nothing to hide, you'd be very happy to do it.
You're absolutely right. And what I find deeply ironic, and this is an observation I made to the Zondo Commission, is that certainly in Britain, and I should think in South Africa too, if you want to open a bank account, if you want to move money internationally, you're subject to all sorts of checks. And sometimes it's pretty hard work to just go about your daily life because of the form filling and the hurdles you have to jump to as an ordinary honest citizen. And somehow these global criminals, the Guptas and others, were able to just circumvent all this. And the standard banks and the standard chartered banks and HSBCs, and above all Bank of Baroda, which is, by the way, an Indian government sponsored bank, and that's another story. They were just able to get away with it. So I do think it's incumbent upon the international financial system to clear up their act. And yet I do think lifestyle audits are important, especially for public officials. I think there should be reforms, and I suggested these to the Zondo Commission, to actually nail individual managers, senior managers in these banks and global corporates who allow money laundering in the future, so they don't do it. It isn't just their bank that might be fined or its license questioned or maybe suspended, as ought to happen. It's also them. So that all these professionals, the lawyers, the accountants, the auditors, the financial advisors, the bankers, all these people doing normally, in the normal run of things, important professional and respected jobs, who made all this possible. Because the Guptas couldn't have looted, and nor could the Zumas on their industrial scale without the assistance of all these professionals. They ought to do their jobs properly, the law ought to be changed and the regulations strengthened, some of the ways that I suggested perhaps to the Zondo Commission. And the international banks ought to tighten up their act, and particularly, if I may, explain this question of client confidentiality that they hide behind. And I did spend some time on this at Zondo, particularly criticizing Standard Chartered Bank, who put in an absurd bit of sophistry by way of response to my criticisms in my written evidence, because the Zondo Commission gives people and entities you criticize in writing the opportunity to respond quite properly. But they kept talking about client confidentiality. Well, client confidentiality for the likes of you or I, Stuart, or the average honest citizen, is something we should be entitled to respect. But client confidentiality that protects global criminals in their money laundering, as in the case of the Guptas, should not be protected. The banks should open up their accounts to the authorities and to other banks and share information. And new regulations have been brought into Britain to try and achieve precisely this. But they hide behind client confidentiality, as they did to me when they came to see me, sort of all worried after I'd exposed them in the British Parliament, HSBC and Standard Chartered and McKinsey and KPMG in particular. They've got to decide which side of the integrity fence they operate on. If they're protecting financial crime, they're on the wrong side of that fence. So I think there's a whole set of reforms needed here. And the global corporates should certainly help in doing that. And the other thing we need, and we need it quickly, and it should have happened already, is countries and jurisdictions like Hong Kong and Dubai and the tax havens in the Caribbean and the Indian government, because the Guptas moved between Dubai and India. They have properties in both jurisdictions. They spent, in the middle of 2019, 400 million ront on a wedding for two of the sons of two of the brothers. 400 million ront on a single wedding for two of the sons. Where did that money come from? South African taxpayers. Spent in India. Properties bought in India, a temple built in India on the basis of looted funds. What are the Indian authorities doing about it? What is President Modi doing about it? What is the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, what is he doing about Dubai as a center for money laundering, and particularly a center for the Guptas to live, to own property, to do business, to move their money through banks? What are they doing about it, all these people? What are the Chinese government doing about Hong Kong's financial center, which was used to money launder as well as Dubai? What is the Indian government doing about the Guptas, who live and were originally from India, have properties in India, built a temple in India with looted South African money? What is happening? It's just like they can go around scot-free, behaving as normal business citizens and so forth. I mean, the governments are culpable as well. It's not just South Africa's fault. Obviously, South Africa's ruling elite under President Zuma and the top of the ANC are the prime, and I say this as a long-standing friend and solidarity activist of the ANC going back decades, who worship Nelson Mandela. They were part of all of this, but it's not just them. It's these governments and authorities around the world as well. And when I tried to kind of get the British government to impose the same sanctions that the American government did earlier in 2019 on the Gupta brothers, which would really damage their ability to live normal business lives, as they have been doing ever since they left South Africa in or fled from South Africa in early 2018. If the British government would impose the same sanctions, and if the rest of Europe would do so, that would be a start. And the Indian government should follow suit. Stop these guys doing what they're doing. And if I sound indignant about it and angry about it, it's because I am, because this money should have been spent on hospitals, on creating jobs, on building houses, improving schools, care services in South Africa, not lining the pockets of wealthy, corrupt individuals. It's criminal.
There would be those, of course, who asks who else is being captured.
Well, they're entitled to ask that, and I suspect we don't know the full story yet.
Yeah,
and I want to see them brought to justice. I want to see them prosecuted. I hope that'll happen. I know there's a determination from President Ramaphosa downwards to do it, but sometimes I think, sometimes the decision making, even under President Ramaphosa, and I know he's hemmed in because he was elected only by 179 votes, was it, out of 5,000 at that ANC conference at the end of 2017. His mandate was a slim one, and he's still fighting the bad guys at the top of the ANC who are trying to get back into dipping their hands in the gravy train, and clambering aboard it. He's got severe problems, particularly with a hollowed out set of state institutions and capacity. I mean, the damage that's been done has been exponential. But I think there needs to be more decisive leadership at all levels, and some steps taken to really bring these criminals to boot, whether they're from the political world or the business world. Otherwise, South Africa is not going to be able to move forward and regain the international investor confidence that it had under President Mandela. It lost in the dog days of the apartheid years, the international commercial community, having worked with South Africa to its shame under apartheid, and then eventually lost confidence as the system of apartheid started to come apart at the seams economically and governmentally, and then enormous respect and confidence in the Mandela era started under the Mbeki era, and then was completely destroyed in the 10 Zuma years. So, there's a lot of work to do to catch up, but there's also tremendous skill and entrepreneurial ability and great ingenuity in this wonderful country amongst its people. So there's a lot of hope still, I think, but you've got to take tough decisions and get the law enforcement operating again.
Lord-Peter-Hain, thank you so much for your time. I hope that the people who need to hear your message will hear it in some way. And good to talk to you, and thanks so much for sparing me this opportunity.
Thank you for having me on, Stuart.
Well, I reckon he's a lot braver than I am. If you're interested in the possibility of having Lord Hain at a dinner, a business breakfast, an exco meeting, send your details to info@famousfaces or call us on 011 784 3111.